Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope all of you have had a great Merry Christmas. This is the second day of Christmas. This is episode 14 with my guest, Suan Sonna. Suan, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on, James.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I mentioned this in the last, not the last episode I had, but another episode where I got to meet you in person in Steubenville. So that was fun. Had a
I
good
remember
time.
that.
Yeah, that was great. And so we were at Dr. Han's house and we went to St. Peter's in Steubenville downtown. So yeah, it was great. We had a
Yep.
great time. And today we are going to be talking about a book that I know has influenced Suan and caught my eye too in terms of interests. And it is Simon Peter's denial and Jesus' commissioning him as a successor in John 21:15-19, Studies in Their Judaic Background by Roger David Aus. This is the book here. I first heard of this book.
There's my
Swan
copy.
got it too. Yeah. Oh, I like your notes in a sticky
Yeah,
notes.
it's very ugly looking, but I got my notes. Yeah.
Well, it does the job. Yeah, I was about to say I watched your back over the summer actually, or actually I think even earlier than the summer too. It might have been the spring. Your interview that you did on Pat Flynn's show, where you talked
Mhm.
about the papacy and biblical theology, which is great. And you know, I've done most of my reading on the papacy in terms of church history, sort of post New Testament, from the first 10 centuries of the church in the first millennium, and also in the second millennium as well. But what I do find interesting, though, Swan, and what I appreciate about your work is that the history of the papacy in the first and second millennium, I think, can be summed up as the history of the exegesis of various texts by different saints and popes on the prerogatives of the Roman See. Because it's really interesting because, St. Pope Leo the Great, St. Pope Gregory the Great, we'll talk about their exegesis of Matthew 16, and on this passage that we're going to talk about today, John 21:15-19. It's just interesting and cool to me how it's like, this is a modern perspective, but like this conversation has been going on for 2 millennia in the church in both the East and the West. So I just find that, fascinating. And I appreciate your emphasis on focusing on the early church period of the, with Second Temple Judaism into the first and second centuries.
Yeah, I mean, these passages like Matthew 16:19 or 18-19 and John 21:15-19, these are what you can call battleground passages. Even Luke, I think Luke 22.
Yeah.
All these other places where Jesus seems to be giving some type of priority to Peter, they've served as battleground passages. Now, this work that we're looking at by Roger David Aus, a lot of the research that he's doing is pretty, I would say, pretty novel in some respects, because the thing is, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a revived interest in Second Temple Judaism, we've been trying to put the scriptures back in their context. And so, recently speaking, you've seen people wanting to explore, like, what was the theory of justification in the second century among the earliest Christians, such as in Matthew J. Thomas's work, Paul's Works of the Law in Perspective of Second Century Reception, right? And for a large part, we've seen a kind of de-Judaizing of scripture. And then even in the history of Christianity, an anti-Judaic view on the scriptures, right? Where we want to divorce it from its mother religion, the texts and the gospels and so on and so forth. And so this kind of revived interest due to the Dead Sea Scrolls, due to, I guess, maybe greater cultural sensitivity or whatever, has actually produced, I think, some really rich insights into the text. And so Roger David Aus's work here, even though it might seem novel, a lot of the arguments and sources he's using are as old as the New Testament sometimes.
Yeah, and that's just it's so fascinating. Hopefully we can get to this a little bit later, but as you said, yeah, it is interesting, and Aus talks about this too a little bit in the book, how he doesn't use these exact words, but I've noticed too a somewhat if you like to pardon the expression, the sort of Martianizing of Christianity with respect to Jewish sources, and then also some cultural influences too, particularly in the 20th century and even before in the 19th century, with a lot of European cultural anti-Semitism, which sometimes seemed to bias even sources that you went to, at least at a sort of clerical level. But then with the advent of sort of, and there's pros and cons to this, as I know you were aware of, like with the advent of German criticism, there was more of like, well, let's just go to the sources type of thing. Not that they weren't doing that before, but again, there's so many things we could go there, but the different perspectives changing is interesting. And so I do appreciate, the refocus to studies in Judaism and the Judaic background, which of course, is also influential, as you alluded to too, the first century perspective on justification and Second Temple Judaism, and the whole new perspective debate that came out earlier in this century. Suan, I wanted to ask you for my first question is, I'm always fascinated with why certain books influenced people. I know from my own life in reading different books, no one reads a book by accident, which sounds kind of like an obvious, like no duh thing. But a book is like, it functions in our story of our lives, but we also kind of participate in the author's life in a way too, by extension, even if they're dead or if it's a new author. For Christmas, I was reading Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. And so I was like, wow, this book is like, over 150 years old, but it's still amazing in the morality and the type of emphasis that's teaching today. But, so I want to ask you, why did you even read this book? What made you read Aus and get interested in his writing? Why?
Yeah, well, so the story begins, I think, after my conversion to Catholicism. So I already was aware of like the Matthew 16:19, Isaiah 22 argument for the papacy, but I wanted to learn more. And so what I had done is I started this at first it started off as like 40 pages of just research on the papacy. And I had my friends, look at it. And I kept on going as far down the rabbit hole as I can, because I noticed that among a lot of Catholic apologists, they were debating whether or not, Peter is the rock of Matthew 16:18. But that question's been settled in scholarship since the 1970s. And so the fact that it's still a debate among, let's say, popular Protestant crowds, that's going to end pretty soon, I think, once more people bring to light, no, that's an untenable position now. So I just think that argument, one is that even though I think it's a relevant argument for the papacy, I don't think that on its own is going to get you the papacy. You're going to have to add in more meat to the bones, so to speak, but that's a good starting ground. And then the second thing is that, that issue has been discussed, and many Protestant scholars are willing to admit that Peter's the rock. And so it's like, okay, we need to start building on the case further. And so in the course of my research, I wanted to find and track all the rabbit holes that I could, right? So I wanted to look into, what Eusebius says about the authorship of Mark. Why does the story of binding and loosing appear in Matthew but not Mark? Is Matthew 16 a genuine historical, authentic event, or do we have to accept kind of redaction criticism and say that Matthew, as a redactor, or maybe the Matthean community later added in that story, right? So, these are all the questions I was exploring. And then eventually, I think it's, I was on Google and I clicked on shopping. When you type in the name of a book and you just type in shopping, right? And I don't remember what I typed into the search bar. It certainly wasn't this long title of this book here. But it was something about like the Gospel of John, or maybe like Simon Peter, right? So I was looking at books on Simon Peter, and then this book appears, and I look at it in the shopping tab, and I click on it, and then I see this long, kind of inelegant but interesting title: Simon Peter's Denial and Jesus' commissioning him as his successor in John 21:15 and 19. And so I look into the book and I see what the thesis is, and it's remarkable. So Aus is making the argument in this book. Well, one is that, so I think the first chapter explores, the ceremony of the atonement itself. So the sacrifice of Yom Kippur, the high priesthood. The second thing that he looks at is then Peter's denial in light of atonement imagery in Palestinian Jewish sources. And then the third chapter is the one that concerns Peter being the successor of Christ as head shepherd over Israel. And so I found out about this book through the course of kind of stumbling through Google. And what amazed me is that, and I'm kind of bleeding into the next question, but what amazed me is that Roger David Aus is a Lutheran. He's not a Catholic, and he's making this incredibly remarkable argument. And so I'll just put my answer there.
Yeah, thank you, Suan. I appreciate that. And yeah, go ahead and bleed into the next question because, I asked who is Roger David Aus? Just if you want to give just a quick sort of intro for those who aren't familiar with him.
What I'm going to do first is I'm just going to read from the back of the book itself, and then I'll give you more description. Right?
Yeah, that's great.
So it says Roger David Aus, PhD, is pastor emeritus of the, and this is, I think, German, and so I don't really know how to pronounce German words very well. It's like Evangelisch Luther Kirchen Gemeinde. Okay, so I'm not going to embarrass myself anymore. In Berlin, Germany. He's the author of 12 other books on the New Testament and a member of the Society of New Testament Studies, the Society of Biblical Literature, and I think it's Gesellschaft für Wissenschaftliche Theologie or something like that. Like, I don't know. Maybe you know how to pronounce those better than me, James. But basically, he's a New Testament scholar. He's German. And, one of his specializations is in uncovering the Palestinian Jewish traditions of the New Testament. And so he specializes in not only those traditions, but also rabbinics. And so basically, rabbinics concerns the period when the oral tradition of the Pharisees and the sages is finally compiled into the Mishnah, and then is later edited further into the Palestinian and then the Babylonian Talmud. And so, after you have Second Temple Judaism, eventually you have the rise of Rabbinic Judaism. You have the codification of the Mishnah and these like other traditions finally being written down after they had been orally communicated among the sages during the time of Jesus. And so, what Aus does is he tries to uncover some of these traditions in the New Testament and in what ways they might have influenced the author of the Gospel of John. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that Aus is quite respected in the New Testament community for his research in this area. So this is, so there's a scholar by the name of David Instone Brewer, and what he's really famous for at the University of Cambridge, he's really famous for uncovering which traditions in the Mishnah are authentically traceable back to the New Testament. And so right now, I believe he has 2 books in his, I think it's going to be 7-volume series. It's called The Tradition of the Rabbis in the Era of the New Testament. And so each of the movements of the Mishnah, he dedicates a book, right, to seeing what traditions in the Mishnah can be traced to the New Testament. And this is a serious question because right now, there's a lot of skepticism towards using rabbinic sources. It's not ruled out, without just definitely, right? So, these sources are still used, like the Mishnah and the Talmud. You can, if you pick up a New Testament commentary that's been written by an academic source, like recently in the last 20 years or even the last 30 years, you're going to see things like the Mishnah and the Talmud being cited. But the question is, to what extent do these things actually historically accurately capture what was going on in the time of Jesus? And so, David Instone Brewer, people like Roger David Aus have been dedicating their lives to this kind of research. And so Instone Brewer, he has a paper titled The Use of Rabbinic Sources in Gospel Studies, and you can find this on Academia. And here he mentions some of the work of Roger David Aus, and so it's still a difficult field because you still have to put a date on a lot of different traditions that come from a lot of different places, right? You're trying to figure out which is authentic and which is the idealization of how the Sanhedrin or the sages debated each other. And obviously you're getting the perspective of the Pharisees. So it's like, how accurate is the perspective when they're talking about the Sadducees or other traditions? But I'm kind of getting in the weeds here. But the point is that, Aus is a recognized scholar in the field. And so he does have certainly things to contribute. And in this book in particular, Aus tries his best to use sources that are early. So, for instance, he had a book before this one that was concerning the resurrection of Jesus and the assumption of Moses. And so it's not under that exact title, but you can find it on Amazon. And the basic idea that Aus was forwarding is that a lot of the resurrection accounts mirror certain accounts about what happened to the body of Moses after he died, right? Certain things are repeated in both sources. And so I read a review of that book, and Aus was criticized for using a lot of later rabbinic sources. So then in this book, what he does is he tries to very carefully show the rabbinic sources here he's using are valid to get at what was going on in the first century. And he uses texts like the Assumption of Moses and other documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls to verify, okay, I'm not just, pulling things out of thin air.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Swan, especially the project of, that comparison of which documents and traditions are harmonious and with the New Testament Christian tradition. Because it's interesting how, because like I think in my episode I did with Gary Machuda, we talked about how a lot of people in biblical studies have emphasized this, and it's kind of lost at a popular level, how Christianity, when it comes onto the scene in the first century, is essentially, it could be viewed as a sort of Jewish sect and Jewish schism. Mm-hmm. And so there is going to be, especially in the book of Acts, once the Christians are kicked out of the synagogues, that's when things start to change a lot for the Christian community. And it's really interesting how there's so many parallels to this influence of Pharisee theology in St. Paul. And so all of that, it just makes sense that projects like this would be undertaken. And I can't wait to delve into more of that stuff for myself in my own reading too, because I've seen the Amazon algorithms after I bought Aus's book. It actually recommended me that series, and so I was just like, oh well, hey. So, but yeah, I appreciate that, Swan. That's definitely fascinating. And so my next question for you is, if you don't mind, just for the audience, do you mind just reading the text from John's Gospel, John 21:15-19?
Yeah, I'll read it from the NASB, the New American Standard Bible. It's my favorite translation because I guess it's considered the most accurate to the original text. It's accepted by most scholars. And so here's John 21:15-19 in the NASB. Now, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my lambs." He said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep. Truly, truly, I tell you," and this is Jesus speaking, "when you were younger, you used to put on your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you'll stretch out your hands, and someone else will put your belt on you and bring you where you do not want to go." Now he said this, indicating by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he said this, he said to him, "Follow me." Okay, so just one thing to note immediately is that I should have pointed this out. I think Roger David Aus uses the NRSV in his version, in his citations of scripture. And sometimes I think he actually just translates the scripture straight up himself, which is pretty epic.
Like a boss.
The NASB uses the word tend, but I think other translations usually use the word feed. And so I think either is fine, but Aus is going to use feed for his particular research.
Yeah, thank you, Swan. I appreciate you reading that. And, so my next question for you is, what is the threefold commissioning of Simon Peter by Jesus? What is significant or important about that? And also maybe what is, commissioning, if you want to talk about that too.
Yeah, so, scholars have debated, why is there a threefold commission? some people have tried to say that in the Jewish ordination rite, usually someone might be asked 3 times if they accept the ordination they've been given. Although I don't think there's much like validity to that argument, because I think there's some skepticism about the reliability of that source, right? Or that argument. I think there's certain things that we know about the Jewish ordination rite, such as the laying on of hands, but the specific like ins and outs of it, I don't think we know it to that level of precision. And I think Aus mentions that in the book. Other people have mentioned something like, I think in the Jewish sources 3 times, you would ask, in certain, certain works, I think on marriage or something like that, like you would ask the bride 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Like that sort of thing. Right. Although, I mean, that's a little weird here in the context of a master to his disciple, so it's not like a marriage vow that's going on here. Right. So scholars typically will say, I think the simplest answer is that the reason why Jesus gives this threefold commission is to undo the threefold denial of Peter when he was in the courtyard of the high priest. And so, Peter in this particular text is finally being redeemed and being restored into service, right? And as you know, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus already prophesies and knows that Satan is going to come after all the apostles, but in particular, Jesus prays that Peter's faith will not fail, and that when he turns back, he will return and strengthen his brothers. And so this seems to be Jesus initiating or finally perfecting Peter turning back and having the strength to strengthen his brothers. And so here we see Peter is kind of finally authorized, right, to be an apostle, to preach the message of Jesus Christ, to feed the lambs, to feed his sheep, and so on and so forth. And so I could go further and talk about maybe the leadership of Peter here, but I think that's a question down the line.
Yeah, thank you, Suan. I appreciate that. And, it's a really striking imagery and juxtaposition and comparison of the denial of Christ by Peter, and then this sort of bookend to that episode with his reaffirmation and healing and redemption by Christ, and then commission by Christ to be the leader of the church. And so I just find that it's a really interesting parallel. And, I appreciate that, Suan. So this is another question that I have for you. I think a lot of times in apologetics, there's different conversations and arguments that are made, and sometimes people speak past each other. And definitions of words are very important, as I know that and anyone that's engaged with theology knows how even single words can cause great divisions. So my question for you, Suan, is this: how would you respond to some who argue Jesus did not commission Peter in the same way that Catholics say he was commissioned? That Catholics are reading back into the New Testament, Vatican I, papal dogma, into the biblical text of St. John's Gospel. How would you respond to that? Because I've heard that objection by some.
Well, I think the first question is, what exactly do you mean by Vatican I papal dogma, right? So what do you think the Catholic is reading into the text in the first place? So some people will say like, oh, that Peter is made like the head shepherd over the entire church, or like Peter is some type of vicar of Christ here, or all the other things that follow with what we believe about the papacy, like succession and so on and so forth, right? What I'd say in response is, without getting into all the arguments that Roger David Aus himself provides in the book, I would say that, look, we have a Lutheran scholar who is making the argument that Simon Peter was commissioned by Christ to be the head shepherd of Israel. And he's not doing this based upon his commitment to Catholic theology because he's a Lutheran, but based upon his research as a New Testament scholar into Palestinian Jewish traditions and the surrounding context of the New Testament. And so what I would say in response is, look, if we're looking into the text, what do we see here? Right. So we see that Jesus is restoring Simon Peter into service, right? And we see that this kind of is part of, the denial of Peter that's prophesied in Luke 22. And so Jesus is committing, if you look at Luke 22, his other brothers into Peter's care. It says, once you have turned again, right, then you can, strengthen your brethren. And so here, Peter is finally being strengthened by Christ to strengthen his brethren. And so it's important then that, some people have said, well, the reason why Jesus focuses on Peter here is because Peter fell the worst and he messed up the most, right? So in my debate with Ty Ninke on my channel, he tried to deny Petrine primacy in Luke 22 by saying like, oh, the reason why Jesus says that Peter will strengthen his brethren is because he's going to fail so hard. And so Jesus is praying for Peter's faith, right? But if someone's faith is going to fail really bad, then you don't also then tell him to be a leader and strengthen his brethren, right? And then you combine this with the other Petrine primacy arguments, like, Matthew 10:2 with Peter being called protos, or, the times that Peter's mentioned in the New Testament, the fact that Peter is the rock of Matthew 16:18. And you see that, okay, the antecedent probability, if you will, that John 21:15-19 is concerning something about the person of Peter, something about Peter himself uniquely, is incredibly high. And even at the beginning of the verse, when you look at, I think it's John 21:15, Jesus asks, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? I think it's in Dale Allison's Oxford commentary on the Bible, on the Gospels, and even in Aus's own book, he makes the argument that when Jesus talks about these, he's talking about the apostles, the other disciples who are present there with him. And so Jesus asks him, do you love me more than them, or more than these apostles, these disciples, right? And so Jesus is clearly centering in upon him at this particular moment. Okay, now you add in Aus's argument about how in the Jewish traditions during the time of Jesus, there was this belief that before Moses died, obviously you see it in the book of Numbers, Moses commissions Joshua to be his successor, right? And the Jews over time, they had used different images and they had written different scenarios like the Assumption of Moses to describe what happened to Moses' body, or what happened when Joshua was commissioned as successor. For instance, when it mentions the sheep, Aus makes the argument that the same three sheep that are mentioned, the younger ones, the sucklings, so to speak, he's looking at the very specific Greek usage of the words in the original Gospel of John. These correspond with three different sheep in Jewish tradition that are, like, for instance, you can find these in the book of Enoch and I think in the Avot of Rabbi Natan and other places, where the sheep that Moses gives to Joshua, I think Moses says to Joshua, you're receiving sucklings, you're receiving these babies. And then also he talks about, and you're receiving the rams or the older ones, right? Like this progression of age, the age of sheep, this is exactly the kind of imagery that you see when Moses is handing over Israel to Joshua's hands. And so Aus, uses these and other kinds of arguments to show that Peter here is like Joshua, being authorized by Moses, or in this case, the new Moses, Jesus Christ, to be the head shepherd over Israel. And so this is, a Lutheran scholar making this argument. He presents other arguments and points, but I think it's worth saying that, look, if you think we're just kind of like reading Vatican I dogma, then let me show you this scholar, and you can actually see certain things like at least papal supremacy coming out of the text itself, this Petrine primacy, if you will. Now, Aus is going to say certain things, however. Aus is going to deny succession to this office. Let's see. Aus is also, that's the main concern that he has. One might argue that also this text doesn't really touch infallibility, and I guess perhaps not. Who knows? But it primarily, if you look at it and you use Aus's argument, you could get something like papal supremacy from it. Because one thing I want to point out, especially when you combine this, and I've actually emailed Roger David Aus about this point. I noticed in my research that, so Aus makes this argument, right, that during the time of Jesus, I believe it is in the Assumption of Moses itself, it mentions that when Moses hands Israel over to Joshua, he seats Joshua on his chair or his seat. Now, where else do we see the seat of Moses being mentioned? Well, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verses 2-3, when Jesus talks about obeying the scribes and Pharisees because they're seated on the seat of Moses, right? So the seat of Moses represents all the authority of Moses. It represents his authority to declare the law, to lead Israel, to guide it, right? And so at this point, we see then this very strong parallel, right, between Peter and Joshua, right? And we see this idea of the seed of Moses being mentioned. Now, the seed of Moses, at least in Jewish tradition, this idea of like this authority to be authorized to teach the law, it comes from Deuteronomy 17:8-13. Now, in Deuteronomy 17:8, I think it's actually verse 13, it talks about how when the judge or the priest who has been commissioned by Moses and their successors issues this a ruling, right? Then if the person who is receiving the verdict rejects the authority of that priest or that judge, they are to be put to death. And then it says fear. Let's see here. I'm trying to remember what it says exactly. It says, what is it? Sorry, I'm blanking actually. Can you pause?
You're fine. Yeah.
Deuteronomy 17. Okay, there we go. I got it now. All right.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, so sorry, just to recap. So basically, when you look at this idea of the seed of Moses, and Jesus says, "Obey whatever they teach you." This goes back to Deuteronomy 17:11. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that Deuteronomy 17:11 and the surrounding verses in the Old Testament were the verses that the rabbis and the Sanhedrin had used to justify their authority, right? Because Moses establishes this legal structure. Now, in Deuteronomy 17-13, it says, all the people will hear and be afraid. Okay, so it uses that formula. All the people will hear and be afraid. If the person who receives the verdict rejects the authority of the judge or the priest who is presiding, before the Lord your God. Now, in Acts chapter 5, Peter, like Joshua, also has to deal with a case of people hoarding their property from Israel, right? So in the Old Testament, it was Achan. In the New Testament, it was Ananias and Sapphira, right? Both of them are hoarding their property, but then both of them are exposed, and then both of them are put to death, right? In the Old and the New Testament. Now, in the New Testament, it says all the people heard and were afraid. Or it says all the people were afraid and heard, right? I remember there's a switch that happens, right? But the first time when Ananias dies, it says all the people heard and were afraid. The second time when Sapphira dies, it says the entire church heard and all the people were afraid, right? So in Acts chapter 5, you're seeing, this kind of, if you will, confirmation of Roger David Aus's argument that Peter has the seed of Moses. Because remember, seed of Moses was used to describe the authority in the book of Deuteronomy of the sages and those who succeeded the place of Moses to issue justice. And one way you would know that they had issued justice is if the person who rejected their authority would be put to death and all the people would hear and be afraid. Acts chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira put to death by God. And then you have all the people heard and were afraid. The entire church heard and was afraid, right? So I presented this argument to Roger David Aus, and he had no comment, basically, so to put it briefly. But the point that I'm making is that argument, that connection I made based on Roger David Aus's research, it actually yields, you can predict certain things that we would anticipate, right, that in the rest of Scripture, this would appear somewhere, right? And I showed through that Acts chapter 5 argument that, the seed of Moses does appear again. And so, those are just some things to point out. That Peter would have, in effect, been a kind of one-man Supreme Court if he sat upon the seat of Moses.
Yeah, that's really good, Swan. That's really fascinating. It's always amazing how much can really be drawn out of the biblical text through exposition and exegesis. And it's, church history and the history of Judaism, I think, bears that out too, with the history of all the thousands and thousands of commentaries that have been written and the research that goes on till this day. It's an amazing text that Scripture is. So I appreciate that, Swan. And my next question for you is, this: what do you think is the difference between the commissioning of all the disciples in general, that Aus talks about, and the commissioning of Peter alone by Jesus in John 21. Aus speaks of Simon Peter as first disciple. What does that mean? If to just combine those two questions there.
So to just take the second one first, so Aus defends the primacy of Peter, and he points out different things, like, for instance, Peter being the rock of Matthew 16:18, the fact that Peter's name in Aramaic would have been Cephas, right? He also points out that in the Jewish tradition, Joshua was considered, the main or primary disciple in the Greek, methetes, of Moses, right? The same Greek word that's used for disciple in Josephus, for instance, to describe Joshua's primacy among the other disciples of Moses. Methetes is used also in the New Testament to describe disciple, right? And so, there's that kind of at least loose verbal connection that you can make between the concept of disciple, right? Someone might say, well, when you call Joshua a disciple of Moses, you're just kind of reading back the word disciple. It's like, no. The same word was used to describe how Joshua was the disciple of Moses, just as you can use that word to describe Peter being the disciple of Jesus, right? So, Peter has this primacy among the other apostles, among the other disciples. Aus does not dispute that, and he actually defends it in, I think, 2 separate sections in the 3rd chapter. But then the second thing, the first question then is, what makes Peter's commissioning here unique from the rest? Especially you've seen people make the argument, well, Peter talks about how the presbyters are also fellow shepherds, right? And so maybe this means that they all equally share the office of shepherd or something like that. Well, before I address that particular objection or that particular question, I think the first thing to point out is that the Joshua typology, the Joshua Moses typology that occurs in John 21:15 and 19 uniquely kind of congregates around Peter in that particular section. And then moreover, in John 21:15 and 19, moreover, you have confirmation of Peter sitting upon the seat of Moses in Acts chapter 5, with the way that ordeal is described to Ananias and Sapphira. And so what makes the commissioning of Peter unique is that no other apostle has this kind of relationship of being Joshua at the moment that Moses, had selected his successor, right? You don't have those Jewish traditions kind of congregating around anybody else except Peter and Jesus at this particular moment. Now, to be fair, you also can include at least one instance. So in John 19:27, when Jesus is, saying to John, "Behold thy mother," right? There is a Jewish tradition, although it is later in the Petra et Moshe, where before Moses dies, he hands over his mother Jochebed to Joshua, and he says to her, "He will now be to you as a son," or something like that, right? He says that to his mother. So, and you have instances where Moses might give over his mother to the disciple Joshua. Then you see Jesus in John's gospel handing over his own mother to a disciple, right? So maybe in that way, you could maybe have John also participating in that typology, right? Especially because that occurs also during the succession process. But what I'm saying is that the unique, let's say, quantity, the great emphasis of the author, the writer of John the Apostle, the Johannine community, or both, is upon Peter being this Joshua successor shepherd in that particular episode in John 21:15 and 19, right? And that's what the whole 3rd chapter of the book is dedicated to. So what sets Peter apart from the rest of the apostles is that he is commissioned, as Joshua was in the Old Testament through Moses, to be the head shepherd of Israel. That's the unique kind of, soil that's being tilled here in this particular passage. Now, regarding the objection from 1 Peter, right, where Peter describes the other presbyters as, fellow shepherds, that's fine. That's not strictly incompatible with papal theology. You have the bishops are also shepherds, right? Just as the Bishop of Rome is, well, to put in Pope Leo's words, the shepherd of the shepherds, right? But I would just say that I don't think that objection on its own is going to even knock out the rest of the research that Aus has presented. And so I would just say here that, it's possible for instance, scholars agree that in Matthew 16:18, Peter's the rock. But as D.A. Carson points out in his Expositor's Bible Commentary, it's possible that you could have this analogy being extended, this image being extended to other people, right? So the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, right? That's fine. Jesus can be the rock in other ways, Jesus being the cornerstone, right? But in Matthew's gospel, Peter is the rock. That's what he intends to express, right? And then in John's gospel, John intends, at least when we can discern with the traditions he was drawing from and that he copiously borrows from, John intends that Peter is the new Joshua who succeeds as head shepherd. And then you find confirmation in Acts 5 and other places, right? That's what I'd say makes Peter unique in this passage.
Wow, yeah, I really appreciate that, Suan. You're really good. I've always been struck at how really good you are at summarizing, but also with like rich, just packed papal biblical theology. So it's really good. I appreciate that. And it's interesting too. Yeah, for the readers, read the last chapter. For the listeners, read the last chapter of Aus, because he does use he draws from the Septuagint citation of the word disciple and how it's utilized in the New Testament, and makes that comparison between Old and New. And so that's a really good point that you brought out there, Suan. And from my own reading, what's really interesting too is that I have not yet read Dr. D.A. Carson's Expositor's Commentary. I've read citations from it on the issue of Peter and being the rock and so forth. But it's interesting that you mentioned how he talks about, and correct me if I misheard this or not, I am not articulating it in the right way, where others could be extended for the usage and symbolism of Peter as rock. Is that fair to say, is what he was saying?
Well, so what Aus is going to say is that this idea of Carson, this idea that other people can be like foundations to the church, that's fine, right? So you can have Jesus being the cornerstone, you can have the apostles and the prophets being the foundation. But what Aus really wants to stress, and he goes so far as to criticize Protestants in his commentary on Matthew, is that Peter is the rock here. This is what Jesus intends to say, or at least what the Matthean Jesus is saying, right? And so Carson really wants to make that point clear.
Yeah, and I guess one of the reasons why that struck me so much is because not in the same vein completely, but there's a citation from Origen's homilies in his exegesis on Matthew and other texts where he talks about how all Christians can participate in the rockness of Christ, of Peter as the rock, the rockness of Peter and the rockness of Christ as well, and how all Christians are Peter and are the rock. And Sachensky, in his work on the papacy, he talks about that from Origen's perspective. And then an older work, Edward Denny, an Anglican, talks about that as well from Origen. So I think that's interesting because it's even though it's not the same way of where Carson's going, it's an interesting principle that's used in a different way in the patristic literature.
Or to use another example, I mean, in the book of Revelation, I think it's chapter 3, verse 7. It talks about how, Jesus has the keys to open and shut, right? Which is obviously a reference back to Isaiah 22:22, which is another text I've used for the papacy, right? But then in this passage, you see, in Matthew 16:19, I would argue, you see Peter having this power to open and shut with his keys that he receives, right? And so some people have tried to say, no, it's either Jesus who has the keys or Peter, right? And you're saying only Peter, but Revelation says Jesus has it. I'm like, no, it's a false dichotomy. They can both have the keys, right? And so likewise here, Peter can be the rock of the church, and so can Christ be the cornerstone, right? It's not a both. It's not an either or. It can be a both and. This kind, typology and imagery. These are pretty flexible, fluid things to some extent, right? And so we shouldn't treat it with this kind of either or rigidity.
Yeah, definitely. And it continues to amaze me how much this dichotomy between either or versus the Catholic both and, as Bishop Barron likes to say, is instantiated in so many debates between Catholics and non-Catholics, whether Protestant or Orthodox, in numerous areas, like across, whether we're talking about the papacy or the Immaculate Conception to holy orders to whatever. It is interesting how this theme of either or both and keeps on coming up. It's something I've continue to be struck by. So it's a good point there, Suan. So my next question for you is, Aus talks about Jesus as the messianic Davidic Sheperd. What does that mean? How have you incorporated that theme into your own thought and your own thinking and debates and so forth. So what does that mean, messianic Davidic shepherd?
Well, so the interesting or the significant thing is that, in Jewish tradition, both Moses and David are shepherds, right? So I think you see this quite clearly. I think in the Old Testament, I think it's clear. I'm pretty sure that Moses is also described as a shepherd at one point for a while. I think between after he had murdered in Egypt, and then before he returned to Egypt during that time period, I think he was a shepherd or something like that. And then also, obviously David was a shepherd boy as well. And so this image of this kind of like good shepherd emerges in messianic thought. This idea that the Messiah is going to be this kind of shepherd figure, precisely because Moses, talking about in Deuteronomy 18:15, a prophet like me will arise from among you, my countrymen, and to him you shall obey. Right. And then obviously with David's kingdom being the high point of Israelite history, you have the nation state, you have piety, you have the temple being constructed. I mean, this is the high point. And so after the dynasty of David falls apart and, Israel is divided and then eventually conquered by other nations and then under Roman occupation, there was this rising desire with the memory of David, if you will, to return to that high point in Israelite history. Mm-hmm. And so eventually this idea of this Davidic messianic shepherd, they all start getting blended in together, right, in various different ways. And so what's interesting is that Aus, near the end of the book, he mentions, this particular point. He says something along the lines of, just as Moses had delivered Israel from Egypt, there was this hope that the Messiah would deliver Israel from Rome. Yeah. And so I was kind of like, okay, there goes Rome, she appears once again here.
Yeah, that's great. That's interesting. So basically the Israelites were trying to make Israel great again. No, I'm joking. But yeah, that is an important point, and that feeds into so many of the messianic sects other than Christianity, of which Christianity is a Jewish messianic sect in the first century, how other sects are trying to say, no, this dude's the Messiah, that guy's the Messiah, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting. It's sort of just the apocalypticism that unfolds there. Well, one question I want to ask you, Suan, and I apologize because I forgot to send this one to you.
No, you're fine.
But Aus, towards the end, this is sort of it's fitting how this is the last, on page 268, this is the last section that Aus addresses, which is a bookend, but it also encapsulates the entirety of the last chapter in his book. It's section 8.6. He talks about Moses' commission of Joshua in Judaic tradition and Jesus' commission of Simon Peter. So I guess the question I want to ask you is, two questions. You mentioned it before, but to unpack it a little bit more, what is the relationship of Moses and Joshua in Judaic tradition, that typology that you mentioned before, in relationship to Jesus' commissioning of Simon Peter? Because that's a very strong motif that Aus really wants to exposit here in this book.
Yeah, so as I said before, Joshua is viewed as the principal disciple of Moses. So you have other men who ascend the mountain, Mount Sinai, with Moses as well. 3 names are mentioned. One of them is Abihu. I forgot who the other 2 are aside from Joshua, but it starts with an N, I believe it is, right? But you have this same situation repeated in the Gospel of Matthew on the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus also takes his 3 principal disciples up the mountain with him, right? And so very clearly, Moses and Jesus are intimately connected together in the early Christian consciousness, right? Precisely because Moses had prophesied that there would be a prophet like him. And then you see people describing Jesus as the prophet from Nazareth. Or even, Aus mentions here in Numbers 27:17, how, Moses was weeping over Israel and tried to find a successor. And it says, so that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep without a shepherd. And that exact phrase, like sheep without a shepherd, is repeated verbatim, I believe, in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus looks upon the crowd and it says he looked upon them like sheep without a shepherd. You can find the citation, right? So clearly there's this already strong ground for this kind of this type of typology, right? Where you have Moses and Jesus, being types of each, Moses being a type of Christ. Okay, so then when we get to Joshua, in this ordination scenario, in the original book of Numbers, the scenario is pretty quick. I mean, it just says, lay your hands upon him. Well, it's interesting that actually it mentions, so when God tells Moses to lay his hands upon Joshua, he says Joshua, son of Nun. So he mentions like Joshua's father's name, right? And then in the New Testament, right, when Simon Peter is being addressed, he's called Simon Bar Jonah, right? The fact his fatherhood is also mentioned in the text once again, just as when Moses was ordaining Joshua, Joshua's fatherhood was also mentioned as well, or the father of Joshua, I should say, right? So he says in John 21, verse 15, it says, now when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, right? And then in the book of Numbers, when Moses is ordaining Joshua, God says, pick Joshua, son of Nun, right? So both times the sonship of Joshua, and the sonship of Peter is being mentioned here, right? And then you have other parallels that start coming out. Like, so for instance, in Jewish tradition, Moses prayed to have his hand stretched out when he died, right? Because his brother Aaron had died in a cave with his hands also stretched out as well, giving out his last breath, right? When it talks about how you're going to be wrapped or girded or veiled and taken to a place you don't want to, in Jewish tradition, Moses is also being described as being wrapped, girded, and veiled as well. So you have all these interesting things that are going on in this passage that are drawing upon that particular scenario in the Jewish consciousness when Moses is on his way to die and has to pick his successor. And so you see those same motifs and images being used here. And Aus, and I think I agree with him, is saying this was intentionally chosen by John to show that Peter is the new Joshua. He is that succession figure, if you will, from Moses to Joshua, from Christ to Peter.
Yeah, definitely. That's very fascinating, Suan. It's a really interesting biblical continuity between the two testaments, and it's really interesting too because sort of implicitly it's asserting, or maybe more explicitly rather, that fundamentally this is the same God, this is the same people, this is the same religion. God has made covenant. We can talk about the ways that different covenants have been made to the various other patriarchs, Abraham, Noah, etc., from the Old Testament going on to the New Testament, and then up culminating to where Jesus says, "This is the covenant in my blood," and that whole beautiful motif. And of course, Feingold is amazing. Dr. Feingold is amazing at explicating the beautiful, rich covenantal Eucharistic ecclesiology that flows from that, which is just amazing. He has a massive fat book on it that I need to read, but on the Eucharist. But thank you for that, Suan. That was really good. And I just kind of want to read this from Dr. Aus here, doing a little book club. But on page 269, he says this: the bilingual Palestinian and Hellenistic Jewish Christians who first heard/read the narrative of what is now John 21:15-19 recognized and would have appreciated the above echoes of Moses' commissioning Joshua to be his successor as a part of the author's great literary artistry. They were accustomed to this practice of creating new, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the word right, but Haggadic scenes based on biblical and later materials from the worship service in the synagogue, homilies, and the Targums, and from the academy, study house, the Bet Midrash. A relevant example of such a Haggadic scene is the dialogue between Moses and Joshua in the 1st century CE, Palestinian Testament of Moses 10:11 through 11:13. Here, Moses, who is about to die, entrusts his successor with the leadership of the congregation of the Israelites. So basically what you just got done expositing there. And this is interesting. This really struck me, and this is why I made that comment before about the sort of maybe implicit Martianizing of Christianity to some extent. And is this, the last paragraph of the first section on 269, he says, quote, Unfortunately, when Gentile Christianity later prevailed, almost exclusively, and Jewish Christians had been reduced to sects, this appreciation was lost. It has taken some 1900 years to recover it. That's like, holy cow. That's significant because, it's interesting too, it just in my mind reading, when he says Jewish Christians had been reduced to sects. Now, regardless of their lack of orthodoxy or their heresy, it's still very important to study the sect and group of the groups such as the Ebionites that affirmed Jesus's messiahship and consider themselves Christian, but they denied Jesus's divinity. They would have been a sort of form of Arian, but not entirely, because those categories took time to develop and so forth. But so I find it interesting how, to the point that Aus was making, how there has kind of been this loss with that. And again, as he said on page 269 here, pulling it back up, that it's taken some 1900 years to recover it. Just what do you think about that, Suan? And especially in your debates and encounters with various people, I know you've been criticized for using Jewish sources sometimes. Yeah. So that's why I wanted to ask you your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm very sympathetic to some of the that sentence where he talks about it took 1900 years to recover it, right? I mean, the earliest citation that I can find for the Isaiah 22, Matthew 16:19 parallel is probably St. Thomas Aquinas. And then probably the next person after him was Cardinal, is it Cajetan during the Reformation?
Yeah, Cardinal Cajetan, who interviewed Luther. Yep. Yeah,
and then after that, during the First Vatican Council, Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16:19 were being cited constantly together. So that played an important role in the First Vatican Council. But so then people will say, well, okay, Suan, it took, let's see here, 1200 years for the church to find, this particular typology. Why isn't it in the first millennium? Right. Or why isn't it more prevalent? And so, when I have to deal with some Orthodox objectors, but even sometimes some Protestant objectors who care about the church fathers, they'll say things like, why did it take so long? Right. And the point that I'm making is that, look, there's a difference between the objective fact that it's there in scripture and, let's say, the subjects that have received it, right? And so maybe it took 1200, 1500, or in Austin's case, 1900 years to find this particular fact about the gospel, right? That John borrowed from particular Palestinian Jewish traditions, right? Because you had to deal with anti-Semitism throughout the history of the Christian religion. You had to deal with the fact that we are now picking up and finding still many new Jewish writings from the time of Jesus or even older that help put everything into context, right? And then you start seeing that a lot of phrases and ideas that are in the Gospels, they come from Enoch. They come from the Deuterocanonical books. You can find them in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? You can find them in other Palestinian Jewish traditions, right? So the point that I'm making here is that I really like, us bringing out that, it took some 1900 years. And why did it take 1900 years? Because of the Gentile Christians, right? And also when the Jewish Christians split into sects, as you mentioned before, right? All kinds of things were happening in the early church. All kinds of things left and right, all kinds of debates, all kinds of concerns, right? So, you had a very rich environment of all sorts of things going on, and it could be very easy to overlook certain things that were going on in the scriptures, right? But, the fact that you had anti-Semitism, you had, not the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls just yet, or other things that have been lost to time but have been recently recovered. There are other reasons why it took 1900 years, or even longer, or even in other cases, it took, over 1,000 years to find certain parallels or connections.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. And I think we need to be careful, because something that I have always noticed with various type of arguments like this, either for or against the Catholic Church's position, but usually when it's against it, on various things, is that, the same principle as a method, logically and using equal scales being applied, could be applied to another doctrine that everyone agrees with in Christianity, in Nicene Christianity, which is the doctrine of the Trinity. Because some could ask, and many secular scholars and liberal scholars have, as you know, if the Trinity is true, why did it take 325 years after Christ to formulate it and for it to be believed? And some scholars will say it's not enough that you have St. Ignatius of Antioch saying Christ is God. That doesn't mean the Trinity is real. What if he was a modalist? And so they ask these questions. And so ultimately, you can't really escape the question of the development of doctrine, and you can't escape the type of process that doctrine takes. I understand coming from various Christian perspectives, especially those from the Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, High Church traditions that have a very reverenced and elevated view of tradition and historical continuity, which I'm not trying to downplay at all. But at the same time, it has to be recognized too, just as a logical principle. Just because something takes longer to be developed, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's false. I understand the suspicion, but or
even if it takes longer to be noticed in the scriptures, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because I'm not saying that this idea of this parallel between Matthew and Isaiah, or Aus's argument, that John was using Jewish traditions during his time, this idea to portray Peter as the successor of Moses. This was something that was received or we found out about later or noticed later, but it was already there. And that's the point that Aus and I are both emphasizing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point to emphasize too. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
It's like finding a dinosaur bone in the ground. And let's say you find a Tyrannosaurus Rex and you say, wow, the Tyrannosaurus Rex didn't exist until I saw it right here. Why did it take this long to, and it's like, no, that was already there the whole time. You just found it later, to like millions of years later. Or if your younger creationist, a couple thousand years later, whatever.
Yeah. It makes me think of that old Vine back in the day with the scene from Jurassic Park with the herd of the Brontosaurus, but they're wearing they're wearing the Jordans or whatever type of sneakers, and it goes, "What are those? What are those?" But sorry, that's where my mind goes to after intellectual conversation with Aus and then Vine. So
yeah, right, yeah.
hashtag rip Vine.
I remember.
But yeah, those are good points. And something I would be curious to research this, and I don't know if you've thought of this yourself, Suan. You probably have, but because I'm curious, and one area of study I plan on doing more in 2022 is theological perspectives from the non-Chalcedonian Coptic Orthodox churches and the Syriac non-Chalcedonian traditions, as well as all the other communions. But I'm curious, though, since they are a Semitic people, I'm curious how, whether Catholic or non-Catholic, how the Syrian churches, the Lebanese churches, the churches in Jordan, for the Catholics in Iraq of the Chaldean Rite, and the Maronites in Syria who are in communion with Rome. I wonder how they've dealt with this passage too, because I would be curious how, with their Semitic mind, how they would be reading it, and if they, I would assume they would be the good corrector for maybe Westerners who've sort of lost their eyes on this, because they've never lost their Semitic sight on this, of course, in the whole tradition of the Syrian fathers. But that's just a thought I've had. I don't know if you've thought about that before with this passage.
Yeah, well, when the interesting thing is that, the idea of Peter being this prime minister figure, you don't find that, I think, in the first millennium. And so that's been used to argue against Matthew 16:19, although I've already addressed that on multiple levels. And so I won't go into great detail on that. This idea of Peter being a new Moses, however, is very much prevalent, or you can find it in the first millennium. So let me actually try to find the quote in particular that I have here. Let's see. So it includes, so it's in St. Ephraim, and I'm trying to find who else. But let me just kind of search through some of my notes here, if I can find it.
Yeah, I love Saint Ephraim. He's like becoming one of my just favorites and just one of my favorite theologians and thinkers.
Yeah, well, okay, so I might actually have a hard time finding this one now, but oh, let's see, is it this one? It's a particular PowerPoint slide. I can't find it anymore. Oh well, looks like I lost it.
It's fine. If you find it later, what you could do is message me, and then I can include it in the.
Yeah, but the quote itself is in it's contained in this book, and some of the citations in the book are good, some of them aren't. But it's like the traditions of the churches in Antioch or something like that. I mentioned it before, but I can also send the link for that. But I'm trying to see if I can find that quote because it's a very nice one. And also I've mentioned Ephraim and this point elsewhere, so you can probably find it on my other YouTube videos. Yeah, I don't think I can find it anymore. Whoops, there we go.
Gotcha. Well, like the scrolls of the Library of Alexandria, all is lost. No, I'm joking. Well, Swan. So, how are you on time? What time is it there for you again?
9:13 right now.
9:13. Okay. Is 9:30 an okay cutoff, or is that too much?
Yeah, we can do like one more question.
Okay. So let me see here. Well, it's the last one will be this. It's not so much a question as I guess your thoughts on it, and it's this on page 268. Aus says in a footnote, he talks about he's quoting from a commentary on the Gospel of John, page 903, regarding Simon Peter as the new shepherd, and he's quoting it from a Jesuit who teaches at Loyola University.
What page is this?
268.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he says, quote, "The fact that the community incorporated this passage into its gospel suggests strongly that the community saw the office of shepherd as part of the plan set up by Jesus and one that was to continue," quote unquote. And then he continues, "How exactly was it to continue?" And then he cites German, which I won't butcher the name.
Yeah, I see.
He cites a scholar.
Ulrich Heckel, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ulrich Heckel, that he says calls attention to the simple fact that Peter himself did not cultivate a successor. So, end quote there. So, what are your thoughts on that? Because I think, for one, it's really interesting when I read that, how the original audience, according to this scholar that Aus cites here in his footnote, saw that this was the plan set up by Jesus and one that was to continue. Now, of course, one could say, well, he's a Jesuit, so, he's Catholic, he has that bias there. And then Aus says for his own self, citing Ulrich Heckel, that seems to sort of be implicitly agreeing with the assessment there too, that the simple fact that Peter himself did not cultivate a successor, I wonder what he means by that. Does he mean simply merely in the New Testament text? But maybe one could find that in the historical record, like with Linus and Clement. But what are your thoughts on that? If you need me to repeat anything, I can. So yeah.
Well, yeah. So this is one of the ways in which Aus can escape the papacy. And, on page 268, he says this at the very end of the top. He says, "The narrative of John 21, 15, and 19 should not be misused to maintain more than this." And by this, he's talking about Peter's leadership role being limited to his lifetime, right? So he's willing to concede all these things about Peter being seated on the seat of Moses, being Joshua over Israel, being the head shepherd over Israel after Christ. But he's going to say that it ended with Peter. Like when Peter died, this head shepherd grand status died with him, right? And so, in fairness, he does cite on, as you pointed out, footnote 347, Urban von Wald, who, as you mentioned, is the teacher at Jesuit Loyola University, right? And so, I'm just going to comment briefly on what I see in the footnote, but, obviously I've given other arguments for Petrine succession. It's interesting that Roger David Aus doesn't, address the early Christian records, that talk about in the 2nd century, succession from Peter,
right.
And the like. But also, in a lot of scholarship, there's two general strategies that are taken addressing the second century fathers, like Irenaeus, and I think Hegesippus is the one who comes before him with the succession list from Peter. What they're going to say is, one, they are reading the monoepiscopacy back into the New Testament, or the New Testament era, right, or the first century. So they're going to say you can't trust the individual succession lists from one apostle to then one bishop to another bishop, because that implies monoepiscopacy, right? And so I argue that no, that it doesn't have to be the case. You could have bishop presidents. So you could have multiple bishops in a single city in the first century, but there was one bishop in particular who was like viewed as the president or the head. You see this at least in Jerusalem, which is under James, which is the closest example that we have maybe of a monoepiscopacy. Scholars today will call him the president of Jerusalem. So you had that presidential structure already. And obviously you do have succession lists in the second century from James to the other bishops in Jerusalem as well, right? So there's that. The second strategy they'll say is that, these lists are just kind of propaganda of the early Christians. They're just fabrications, right? And so my argument would be that, you have multiple independent sources mentioning succession from the apostles. All the churches take for granted that, all the Orthodox churches take for granted that this is true, that they had succession from the apostles, and so on and so forth. So my inclination is, the same kind of epistemology that I have with any testimony, which is initially trusted until you're given reason otherwise, right? And if you can show that, okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be monoepiscopacy, then any barrier that you have to not trusting that testimony has already been removed. And so you should be charitable and say, I think they're probably being genuine when they're talking about some type of memory of succession from Peter of some sort in the churches, right? But that's just a summary of the arguments that I'd raise. But Urban von Wald, so he uses this argument that the fact that the community incorporated this passage into its gospel suggests strongly that the community saw the office of shepherd as part of the plan set up by Jesus and one that was to continue. So one thing to point out is that I don't have the commentary in front of me, so I can't see the rest of the argument that this scholar raises. But what I can say is that, obviously this image of shepherd was used. You have Peter writing this pre-67 AD in his epistle, his first epistle, right, where he's writing in Rome and he's talking about, how the other presbyters are shepherds with him, right? And so some people, I guess what Urban von Wald is arguing is that using this image of shepherd again in the late 90s, right, in the end of the first century with the Johannine community or the Apostle John himself or both writing this gospel, shows that they viewed this idea of shepherd as being part of Christ's original plan, right, of having a shepherd over the congregation, over the church. Okay. And so I think that's interesting to think about. And certainly, you have people like Clement talking about how Jesus warned the apostles to protect the office of bishop, right? So I think that this idea of having heads over the churches, that was already planned by the Lord himself to have leaders in the church. Okay. And then when Ulrich Heckel says in his German commentary that Peter himself did not cultivate a successor, my question is, where does he get that from? So he doesn't. So the New Testament doesn't explicitly give us the successor of Peter, and neither. You can you have Clement's name mentioned in Philippians, but you don't have Peter specifically laying his hands on anybody. At least
right, that explicit connection
as his sole successor in, let's say, Rome or Antioch or elsewhere, right? But clearly, Peter did ordain men to the ministry of the church, right? But so the question is, where did he get that from? Also, we don't have the death of Peter in the Gospels either, in the book of Acts. The book of Acts kind of ends at an awkward place. Peter's in Antioch and Paul's on his way to Rome. And it's like, wait, okay, this is it? Like, wouldn't you include Paul being beheaded or, the other things that are really significant that we have to get outside the Bible? So I would just say that I don't buy this idea that Peter himself did not cultivate a successor. I think he had selected, even scholars like Michael Licona today, or even Marcus Bachmuel at Oxford, based on living memory of the earliest witnesses, accept that Clement was ordained by Peter in Rome. Okay, so I don't see the idea where Peter himself did not cultivate a successor come from.
Yeah, because that's the same question I had. You just said it way better. I part of me wonders, because Aus is a brilliant person and very sophisticated. So part of me wonders if, without saying it, and I'm not trying to be simplistic here, how his doctrine maybe of sola scriptura is functioning in relationship to his scholarship here. At least, maybe not even sola scriptura, maybe more so the principle of, even though it would be related to sola scriptura, that if I can't find it in the New Testament text, then it's not constitutive of revelation. Now, I know there are Protestants who believe in tradition being revelation, like many high church Lutherans and Anglicans will believe that. But I'm wondering if for Aus, if that's what his limitation is. I'm just speculating here, but I'm just wondering if for him, if it's, because I've seen other types of Protestants do this too, where if it's not in the New Testament, I mean, Calvin in his Institutes makes a similar argument about Peter in Rome and so forth, or having successors. It's been a while since I've read it, so I'm open to correction if I get the details wrong. But basically, the gist of what Calvin says is essentially a similar thing, where Peter cannot be the first pope because that's not like recorded in scriptures. Essentially, that's simplifying it, but that's essentially what Calvin's saying. He says much more than that, but so yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but that's just my sort of speculative thoughts right now.
Yeah, I'm going to be careful about speculating about what Aus believes. I mean, obviously, Aus is willing to cite extra biblical sources to make sense of the text. And I'm not sure, some people have accused him of denying the historicity of the Gospels because, he's showing that so many of these ideas and beliefs come from the Jewish tradition. And I think he accepts maybe he might be some type of redaction critic or something like that. As many scholars are in the field. And some people might accuse him of just saying that these aren't historical. These are just the imagination of the community or whatever. They're writing it down, making it up, compiling, drawing from other Jewish traditions, what have you. Right. So I think, as I stated before, this is speculation. I want to be careful. It would be better if the man were here himself to give his opinion. Right. But I think the reason why Aus might not accept Petrine succession is because he might reject I'm sure he'd accept the validity of Clement. I think he even cites Clement in his book. But he's going to, I think, side with the scholarship when they also say that the succession lists in the 2nd century are just Christian propaganda. I think that's what's, I think that's might be what's going on.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And just to clarify, too, I'm not speculating in bad faith or anything against Aus. I'm just trying to connect some dots here because whatever type of paradigm it would function as, because that would fit in it too with my speculation thought, where if it's agreeing with scholarship that this is Christian propaganda, and if that is in fact true about Clement and Linus and other the apostolic fathers, then yeah, you wouldn't want to include in a scholarly paper or in other type of research, or even just for your own belief, that anything extending beyond what was written in the text of the New Testament in the Jewish Palestinian Christian tradition would be true. Basically, you would want to go to the more reliable earlier tradition, not this propaganda that comes later, if that thesis is true. So that makes total sense. Yeah. Well, Suan, that's all the questions I have for you today. And I'd love to have you back on, do more of a type of book club with you, getting dat Aus sauce, as we said before in the show. And we've messaged each other too on this. But yeah, I'll have so much respect for Aus. It'd be cool if I could try to get him on too. That'd be fascinating. But I'm sure he's very busy. But yeah, so I appreciate you coming on, Suan. And do you want to give a plug for anything that you're doing or that's coming up on your channel?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel, my Facebook page, and Patreon are all called Intellectual Conservatism Podcast as well. And so this, this month I've kind of been taking a break and also just kind of relaxing and working on my leg because I've been having some leg pain. But in the month of January, I think it's on January 8th, I'm going to have a conversation or dialogue between Joe Schmidt and Rob Coons on the Kalam argument. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Let's see here. At the end of the month, I think on January 30th, I'm having Sebastian Morello on to talk about the aesthetics of Aquinas and Roger Scruton. So we're going to discuss, the Thomistic aesthetic theory and stuff like that. So the month of January is going to be interesting. And then if I remember properly, obviously in January, we're also going to have an episode on classical theism and God's love. So how can a God who's impassible, simple, you name it, how can he love us? That's an objection that's come up recently. And so I'm having on Matthew K. Menard, Christopher Tomaszewski, and Gavin Kerr, all three on. So it's going to be a powerhouse.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds really fun and exciting. Just a quick thing before we go too. I've been watching a lot of older reason theology videos, mainly on Palimism, Scotism, and Thomism, and with Dr. Bradshaw and Dr. Goff. And then I saw on your YouTube channel that you had done an interview with them. So I'm planning on watching that pretty soon here. So yeah, everyone go check out Suan's channel. A link for that will be in the description. And, I've been your host, James Stoffinger Jr. This was episode 14, going over Roger David Aus with Suan Sonna. Everyone have a great Merry Christmas. If you're a Catholic, this is the second day of Christmas going into the third. Merry Christmas. And to all, a good night. And thanks again, Suan, for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.